But Dean Burgon did not neglect the special value of separate manuscripts. At least it will be admitted that he entertained and expressed very strong objection, in which many others concurred, to the very high estimate formed by many critics of B and Aleph. If there is on one side a very high admiration for these manuscripts, there is also on the other side a large number of scholars who have a great objection to them. There are many eminent men on our side, and I think if you set store by the admiration for Aleph and B on the one side, you ought to put the objections to them in the other side. It was said that Dean Burgon merely counted heads, and that the character or weight of manuscripts was therefore virtually nothing, it being supposed that he imagined one to be equal to another. But Dean Burgon never adopted this line of argument. Some people are of opinion that he thought a late cursive was as good as an early uncial. But this was not the case, and he and those who agree with him have never dreamt of maintaining such a thesis. What we have always said is that when the mass of the later manuscripts go together, they outweigh one or two other ones. We never take the cursive separately. In order to controvert the erroneous impression regarding his views that he cared for numbers only and not for weight, Dean Burgon constructed and worked out to a considerable extent his theory about the 7 notes of truth, which he maintained were antiquity, number, variety of kinds and countries, weight, continuity, context, and internal evidence. He laid great stress upon antiquity. Of course, number is something, for if you multiply evidence by any figure, it is surely of more value when it is numerous than when it was single, although one would be almost inclined to suppose that some people imagine that number derogates from the value. There is no time now to dwell upon the remaining notes of truth, but there is one other point which I should like to notice before I go further, and that is this. There are 3 classes of evidence: Greek manuscripts, versions into different languages, and quotations of the New Testament by the Fathers. Some people suppose that we lay more stress upon the quotations of the Fathers than upon anything else. That is quite an error. We lay most stress upon manuscripts, and anybody who goes carefully into the evidence and into the different passages must, I think, do the same. Suppose we come to a passage which is not a very important one, perhaps, and which is perfectly decided by the copies. We say that there is no necessity to go further and to call in the versions and the Fathers. The manuscripts themselves decide the question, and great care ought to be exercised in applying the other 2 classes of evidence. I think on some occasions Tischendorf has wrongly quoted Latin manuscripts, when there is not sufficient evidence to justify such a course, the difference of reading being capable of explanation by the difference of idiom and not necessarily by any question connected with special words. And then again, with regard to the Fathers, it is evident that great caution must be employed in dealing with them. You must be cautious how far they are used, but in many respects they are most valuable, especially, perhaps, in regard to such matters as omissions. For instance, in the case, say, of the word prototoken, where the mention shows that it was in the Father's copy, or especially when a reference is made, not an exact quotation, but in an explanation of a passage, then the Fathers become extremely valuable. Another caution is to be urged with respect to texts of the Fathers. Some scholars holding the objection that the words may have been altered. My impression is that if those texts were looked through thoroughly, these critics would withdraw a great part of their objection. Of course, we wait for the editing of the Fathers. But if we take editions like Stieren's Irenaeus or Otto's Justin Martyr, we find the changes are very few and small. The principle I venture to lay down, therefore, is that of the many against the few, and the necessity for a careful consideration and weighing of the evidence. Passing from that, I want to draw your attention to another point upon which there has been some misapprehension, and that is the claim we make for the acceptance of 15 centuries impressed upon the traditional text. People have thought when we spoke of the Church doing this, that we had in our hands some arbitrary decision to which all people were bound to pay attention. Instead of that, we urge it as a proof of reasonableness. It is well known by those who study the history of the Church that even the clear and plain decisions of councils were not taken to be final or to have the authority of general councils until they were subsequently ratified by the universal Church. They were examined on all sides, and when they were approved, respect gathered round the council in question, and the decisions of it became valid and fixed. There was, of course, in the present case, no public controversy. So far as we know, any such must have been man and man, and not, at any rate, so public as to descend to us. That, I think, renders the decision even more strong. Then I wish to remind you that the period to which we refer was the 4th century, which was the great verifying age of the Church, soon after the time when the Roman Empire became Christian. All the finest intellects in the world were turned towards these subjects, upon which people felt and thought more than upon anything else. As an illustration of this, I may refer you to the great respect paid today to the Nicene Creed, or again the respect felt for the canon of Holy Scripture. When they had decided upon the canon of the New Testament, surely they must go on to settle the words of the New Testament, and they so seem to have done. But this became a much longer process, because there were but a few books upon each of which the canon would have to be settled, but innumerable readings. Accordingly, a long period of years would be taken up in the settlement of the vast numbers of questions involved. The fortunes of the Roman Empire delayed it very much, and the consequence is that the final settlement has not been made, as we maintain, up to the present time, when our immense collection of evidence puts us in a much better position to form our conclusions than at any previous time. The process of settlement went on until the end of the 7th century, and in saying this I have the agreement also of Dr. Hort. After that time, the traditional text, which had been mainly received before, was finally settled and accepted. The fact that this was the great verifying age of the Church did not mean that there were any new decisions made. They made no fresh departure, but they simply ratified what had been in practice in the Church before. This ratification was expressed in the words uttered at the Council of Nicaea by all the bishops: "Let ancient customs prevail." Therefore, when the question of the text was settled, it is reasonable to suppose that it was decided that the traditional text was the text which had been mainly read and used from the earliest times, and that it was a part of ancient custom. So that leads us, I think, to see that in Dr. Hort's system and in other systems before his, there was a narrow view of estimating tradition. I think the authors did not see the vast volume of tradition which descended all over the church, but were inclined to trace everything through a small body, such as the school at Caesarea. I think we hardly understand the extraordinary attention paid to Holy Scriptures in the earliest times. It is very remarkable that many more quotations were found from the Old Testament in the works of the early fathers than from the New. And the reason is clear. People outside the church first had to understand the nature of the one true God and then to come to Him. They learned that in the Old Testament, and that was what struck them more than all. And when they had been taught that, they could go on to the teaching of the New. In this way, the Holy Scriptures, Old and New, were a most powerful engine, first of all in the conversion of the people, and then in teaching them. And so for their own study, they must have had copies all over the church. They read them also in their services, and wherever there was a church, there must have been manuscripts of Holy Scriptures in daily use. When one decayed, it was replaced by another. So there was not a country where there was not some stream or streams of descent, like the Western text and the Alexandrian. I quite agree that those texts existed, but beside them there was not a place that did not hand on the tradition which was carried down as if in rivulets extending over the whole surface of the church. If this was the case, it shows the reason why two manuscripts of the same text, issuing probably from the school at Caesarea, should not have been accepted all over the church. There was an immense volume of tradition at variance with them, and that was the reason why their texts fell out of general vogue within 50 years after those manuscripts were made. You require some proof. I think I have some as far as it goes. You remember that some of the chief men who established the Nicene Creed finally in universal acceptance were St. Basil and the two St. Gregories. It is remarkable that these three fathers witnessed very largely, more than almost any others of their time, to the traditional text, or rather the traditional readings, and you will remember that all these three came from Cappadocia, two from Neo-Caesarea, and one of the Gregories from Nazianzus, not very far from Caesarea. Does not that seem to show there was a descent genealogically of manuscripts in favor of the traditional text, which taught them to witness so much to it? There is even a little more proof that such a tradition was carried on in those parts. In the early centuries, Gregory Thaumaturgus, a pupil of Origen, witnessed to the traditional text just about in the same way, and he also lived at Neo-Caesarea. This brings us back to the very difficult time before we have any manuscripts existing, which reaches back to the delivery of the autographs. With respect to that, you will remember, in the first place, that it is now generally understood that the reason why we have no manuscripts is because the New Testament was in early days written upon papyrus, which was of a perishable character, and therefore they have not descended to us. Many of you will remember that last year, by the kindness of the Margaret Professor, we had in a lecture given by Mr. Kenyon some specimens of papyrus shown us, and as a matter of fact, he went rather farther than I am myself disposed to go. But there is no doubt, I fancy, that in the first days they used papyrus, and that is the reason why we have no manuscripts in our hands representing those times. Before I go into that subject, I think there is a point which is very much deserving of consideration, and I find that it has not only struck myself, but it has struck at any rate one of my learned friends. It is that Dr. Hort has strained the theory of text, and that generally among critics the theory of text has been strained in its consideration. I am not going to say anything against the theory of text generally within due limitations. It was introduced by Bengel, who was followed by Semler and Griesbach and Hug, and it was adopted in this century by others, and especially by Dr. Hort. He slightly altered it by the introduction of what he called the neutral text. He considered that in the early times there were three texts: the Western, the Alexandrian, and the neutral. I should say we doubt very much indeed the existence of the neutral text, except in a very popular way, which I will describe directly, and upon which I maintain that the evidence is satisfactorily strong. When people read about a text, they are apt to consider that it must be some complete setting of words and expressions. And indeed, what is said and written about it sometimes leads me to suppose that they consider everything written in the West belonged to the Western text, whereas of course text is merely a collective word denoting a number of readings in the particular part of the world to which it refers. Besides these, it includes also other readings which belong to the true text, whatever that may be. In early times, people took the general readings of the New Testament and added some peculiar ones of their own, which prevailed especially in the locality. And that was the way in which they made a composite kind of text, partly belonging to the true text, and partly colored with readings of their own. Now what we ought to call them is, I maintain, not texts but readings. When you once begin to speak of texts, and consequently a beginner comes to consider texts, he naturally clothes the word, so to speak, with flesh and bones, and makes it into something, whereas if it is merely collective, it is a very different matter. This, I maintain, is the only way of safeguarding them, viz. To call them readings instead of texts. It comes to this. Supposing we were to take in the early days a map of the church. Instead of having red, or whatever color it may be in the West, and yellow for Alexandria, and so forth, we should dot the world all over. There were everywhere reasons for corruption, which must have been produced in early times. It was so produced all about the Christian world, but in certain particular regions you would have more marks, as I maintain, of corruption, and perhaps also slightly different in characteristics. I think that is a very important point, and must lead, if it is not attended to mistakes. Dolus latet sub verbo, text. There are also difficulties in this way. Alexandrian is a very perplexing text to make out, and with respect to the Western, there is a very considerable difficulty there too, because the Old Latin versions differ so much among themselves. Beginning with the Brixianus, F, on the one hand, and ending with the Babiensis, K, there is an immense amount of variety, so that on very many passages you are able to use on both sides Old Latin texts. I think it is much safer to follow, to a great extent, Dean Burgon's theory, which is worked out very ingeniously upon the various kinds of corruption. With respect to the origin of B and Aleph, which will be of course neutral documents, I believe both came from Origen, which was the first textual critic. I think Dean Burgon has been hard upon him sometimes. He was a man of wide observation and had traveled very largely. He went to Rome besides living in Alexandria, to Arabia, Petrea thrice, to Caesarea several times, besides spending there the latter part of his life. He also went to Greece and sojourned in Neo-Caesarea. As you know, he edited the Old Testament and prepared an apparatus of manuscripts for editing the New. He can frequently be quoted on both sides, for he used manuscripts of a different character, and it seems therefore that he laid his foundations as widely as he could, with a view to a future revision or settlement of the text. Moving from Alexandria, he went to live at Caesarea, where he laid the foundation of the school at that place, in which he was followed by those who were successively bishops of that city: Pamphilus, Eusebius, Acacius, and Euzoius. The two latter were engaged, as we are told, in a colophon, in copying from papyrus onto vellum. There are various reasons for concluding, and I think it is generally admitted now, that the probability is, at least as far as the evidence goes, that the 50 manuscripts produced by Eusebius in compliance with the letter from Constantine included the Sinaitic and the Vatican. Now, taking into consideration these 50 manuscripts, seeing there were 48 others, my impression is that they were according to the school of origin of different characters, or Oregon. Supposing they were not, but that, as Dr. Hort might say, all the 50 were B's and Alephs, how would he explain this? They went to Constantinople and were used in the churches there. Supposing they embodied in them the true text, they must have had an almost untold influence. They came from the highest school, were exceedingly handsome, and if they all agreed, must have impressed their character upon the church at Constantinople. Yet so soon was the traditional text accepted at Constantinople that those in the last century who treated of the earliest text styled that text Constantinopolitan or Byzantine, which Dr. Hort calls Syrian, and which we call the traditional. How then can this be explained? I conclude, therefore, that these manuscripts were not of the same, but of various kinds. I have very little more time, and I must very rapidly say what I have to say. The evidence in the early centuries is this. All right, I will continue the evidence of the early centuries in the next video. Thank you. Lord willing, I will do that. Thank you.